Venezuela, the biggest disaster since World War II for any country not at war. That's saying something.
It really is. I mean, Zimbabwe's collapse under Robert Mugabe, fall of the Soviet Union, Cuba's disastrous unraveling in the 1990s, the crumbling of Venezuela's economy has now outpaced them all. It's the largest single economic collapse outside of war in at least 45 years.
Think of this. Zimbabwe. We've always held up the Zimbabwe, billion-dollar bill.
Yeah, I have $1 trillion bill in the other room.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
We've held that up as a sample of what could happen, and everybody knows it, and everyone knows Zimbabwe was a disaster.
To the point of you couldn't believe a Western or developed country could ever really have that happen.
Yeah, you could see that unique in Africa, right, and you're like, okay,
with
that's
a dictator,
in Africa. Correct.
Yeah, okay,
right.
Now Venezuela is one of the richest countries in the world, and it's happening there, and it's actually
still
worse.
is. It's just not being utilized. I mean, it has the biggest oil reserve in the world.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. I love this quote. This is an economics professor at Harvard. It's really hard to think of a human tragedy this scale outside of civil war. This will be a touchstone of disastrous policies for decades to come. By the way, vote socialist. I mean, at the same time, that description is being talked about. A socialist.
Read that again. His last line is phenomenal.
This will be a touchstone of disastrous policies for decades to come.
Now listen to this part.
I mean, that's incredible.
Yeah, I know. What did he say after that?
That was the second part of the quote. The first part was, it was really hard to think of human tragedy on this scale outside of civil war.
It's crazy.
Yeah. To find similar levels of economic devastation, economists at the IMF pointed to countries that were ripped apart by war, like Libya earlier this decade or Lebanon in the 1970s. But Venezuela, at one point Latin America's wealthiest country, as we mentioned, has not been shattered by armed conflict. Instead, economists say the poor governance, corruption, and misguided policies
what do they talk about the misguided policies?
They don't really. If you're looking for the word socialism, I don't think you're going to find it in here. But it's the New York Times story. But I am glad that they're at least covering it. I mean, misguided policies, yeah. And they do say, to their credit, misguided policies of President Nicolas Maduro and his predecessor, Hugo Chavez. One of the things socialists have tried to do to get out of this is to say, well, it was really Maduro who came in and screwed it up. That's not true.
Well, they did that with Lenin. It was fine with Lenin. It was Stalin that really screwed it up.
They have fueled runaway inflation, shuttered businesses, and brought the country to its knees. In recent months, Trump administration has imposed stiff sanctions as well to try to cripple it further. As the country's economy plummeted, armed gangs took control of entire towns, public services collapsed, and the purchasing power of most Venezuelans has been reduced to a couple of kilograms of flour per month. Imagine living through that. It goes on. Let's see. Venezuela has the world's largest proven oil reserves, but its oil output, once Latin America's largest, has fallen faster in the past year than Iraq after the American invasion in 2003. Venezuela has lost a tenth of its population in the past 2 years as people fled, trekking across mountains, setting off Latin America's biggest ever refugee crisis.
If I remember right, in 2003, weren't some of the oil wells on fire?
Oh yeah, they set them on. I mean, as they were leaving.
I'm trying to remember when that was. Mm-hmm. It seems so long ago now, and it was. But they were setting oil wells on fire
to make sure no one could access them afterwards.
And this collapse just from policies, just from the government taking it over. Remember, that's what they did. Anybody who's like, democratic socialism's great. Well, all we have to do is just take over some of these industries like healthcare. Oh, and energy too, because Hugo Chavez took over healthcare, which there's none, and also the oil industry.
Yeah, there's some more coming up on the healthcare industry that's working out pretty well. Venezuela's hyperinflation expected to reach 10 million% this year. Just the 10 million%, though, not 11 million%. That would be too high. According to the IMF, by the way, it's on track to become the longest period of runaway prices since the Democratic Republic of Congo in the 1990s.
Okay, hang on just a second. Do you know why they can't stabilize their money? They can't stabilize their money because they can't stabilize the system. Because you never know what the government is going to do next. You don't know what disaster they're going to inflict on their own nation. So you could go over there and say, look, we're basing our money on oil. We're going to base our money on oil. It's as good as gold, and we have it. We have it in the ground. You don't even know you have gold in the bank. We know we have oil. So we'll base it on our oil. But we're going to run our oil industry to get that oil in a non-corrupt fashion and in the style of the Western world, so it's dependable. Then you could actually stabilize your economy. You can't do that under socialist and a dictatorial government that is rife with graft and corruption.
And honestly, why they just don't officially go to like Bitcoin right now, I do not understand. Just do it. I mean, that's what the local economy is essentially run on. Anyone who actually has money has put their money into things like cryptocurrencies. We think of those as really unstable, but I mean, in comparison to what they have, it's super stable. And you can use it, of course, send it anywhere in the world and protect it from governments and all of these things. So they tried to do a national government cryptocurrency, which kind of defeats the purpose of a cryptocurrency.
Yeah, and the government the government right now, Maduro just wants to control everything. He wants to make sure he knows who's eating and who's sleeping and everything else. So a national cryptocurrency, A, we don't believe you won't inflate those numbers, and B, the point is it's almost an anti-government stance. It's an anti-control stance.
Right.
We don't want anyone controlling it.
It's supposed to be separate from not only governments, but any third party.
Yep.
By year's end, Venezuela's gross domestic product will have shrunk by 62% since the beginning of the recession in 2013. By contrast, the median economic decline of the former Soviet republics was about 30% during the peak of the crisis in the mid-90s.
Oh, my gosh.
So more than twice as bad as the collapse of the Soviet Union.